Hello and welcome, ladies and gentlemen. We are excited to start Engage 5.0, the fifth edition of Steelman's webinar series. We have a range of topics to be discussed over the next 3 days after having already covered a few earlier in the day today. Our topic for discussion in this session is Indian steel exports poised for a rebound. I'm Madhumita Mukherjee, Group Editor, Steelmint, and I have with me my colleague Sakina Rizvi, Senior Research Associate, who is driving the Indian flat steel exports market and the domestic pipes market. Sakina will co-host this webinar with me. Welcome to Engage 5.0, Sakina.
Thank you, ma'am.
Welcome. We also have with us a special guest for this session, Mr. B. Sadashiv Shetty, General Manager Commercial at Abu Dhabi-based Al Ghurair Iron and Steel. We will talk to Mr. Shetty, discuss in greater detail the Indian steel export scenario, especially from the Middle East perspective. But before we start the Q&A, I request Sakina to make a presentation. Sakina,
Sure.
please go ahead.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I am here to give a brief about Indian steel exports. Before moving ahead with the presentation, let me give you a brief overview of Steelmint. With over 600 price assessments and 500 data sets, Steelmint has emerged as a leading market intelligence firm over the last decade. Coming to the Indian steel exports, India's steel exports fell by about 15% year-on-year in April to October 2023 to around 4.63 million tons compared with 5.4 million tons in the corresponding period of last fiscal. In October, steel exports fell by around 52% month-on-month to 0.26 million tons against 0.54 million tons. The same fell by 40% against 0.43 million tons in the same period last year. Now, if we see commodity-wise steel exports, finished flat products of steel accounting for the bulk of India's total exports decreased by around 4% year-on-year to 3.76 million tons. Exports of hot roll coil and plate stood at around 1.63 million tons during the period, while exports of semi-finished steel such as billets fell by 52% year-on-year to 0.5 million tons. Long products such as rebar, wires and structures stood at 0.37 million ton in 7 months of FY24, a decrease of 20% year-on-year. Now let's have a look at the country-wise steel exports. India's exports to the EU, the largest export destination, were assessed at 1.98 million tons during the period under review, an increase of 36% year-on-year. Exports to the UAE dropped sharply by 36% to 0.32 million tons in April to October 23, while exports to Vietnam plunged by 72% to 0.16 million tons. The key reasons behind the drops are: first, strong domestic demand and higher domestic prices. Indian steel mills have paused their export offers for flat steel products since mid-September 2023. However, mills have resumed offers for Europe recently. The domestic HRC prices stood at INR 57,100 per ton, which is equals to $688 per ton for the period April to September. On the other hand, Indian mills export offers averaged a far lower to $597 per ton FOB in H1 FY24, owing to weak global demand. This price difference incentivized mills to prioritize the domestic market. The general elections which held recently and a boost in automotive sales had fueled domestic demand. Second, competitive offers from China. The sharp rise in Chinese steel exports, which increased by around 35% year-on-year till October this year due to dull domestic demand, unable to compete with China's low-cost offerings, Indian steel exporters have witnessed a decline in shipments to Asia and the Middle East. However, after the production cuts news in China and increasing Chinese futures, we see Chinese prices improving. Now, let's have a look at global steel price trend. Global steel prices have shown an uptrend in late November. All major mills across the globe, like Bao Steel, Shagang Steel, Huafat, Nippon Steel, has hiked prices for their upcoming shipments. The recent production cuts in China in response to the flat control policy and government measures is acting as a trigger for domestic prices in China, which are influencing global prices in a cascading effect. The output drop means lesser domestic supply, which is pushing up domestic prices. Going forward, we expect India's steel exports to drop a sharp 25% in FY24. One, China's aggressive exports stands almost eased Indian exporters out of the market. China captured India's traditional export market, Vietnam, and an emerging one like Middle East, with attractively lower offers that were difficult to match. So this is all I had to present. Thank you.
Okay. Thanks a lot, Sakina. That was a very pertinent presentation, giving an insight into the timeline over the last 2 years or so. According to the World Steel Association, India was still a bright spot in the global steel industry in 2023. We haven't ended the year yet, but still, thanks to a well-managed inflation. The automotive and consumer durable sectors are expected to grow steadily, leading to a healthy growth in steel demand at, say, 7.3% in 2023 and 6%, a little over 6% in 2024. But then, as we have seen, India's steel exports have not been performing well and for quite some time. From Sakina's presentation, we saw that exports to Europe had risen over April, May last year in the immediate aftermath of the Russia-Ukraine war, when European buyers went into panic buying mode. And then sales started tapering off as the world got caught in the grip of inflation and rising energy prices. In India, the export tax was implemented from May last year to cool down prices. Closer to the timeline, flat steel exports dropped 4% in April-October 2023. This year, exports dropped. The trend continued because other issues cropped up. To refer to the latest data, for instance, exports fell by about 15% year-on-year in April-October 2023 to around 4.63 million tons. Exports fell on weak global demand, but also due to stronger domestic steel demand and prices. And of course, China was very active on the exports front with highly competitive prices, which took away some of the markets for India, namely Vietnam and the Middle East. Now it is time for a discussion with Mr. Shetty, B.S. Shetty, General Manager Commercial at Al Ghurair Iron and Steel. He's based out of Abu Dhabi, UAE. Mr. Shetty is responsible for the sales and marketing, purchase and logistics, finance, HR, and IT functions of the company. He has been involved with the company since its inception in 2006. Aegis is the largest producer of galvanized steel coils in the GCC and has an annual production capacity of 5 lakh tons. Prior to his transfer to Aegis, Mr. Shetty was the general manager of Trans Gulf Aluminium Industries, Dubai, another Al Ghurair Group company. Mr. Shetty has been in the UAE for over 2 decades and has traveled widely for business development. We will also take audience queries in this session, and so viewers, please keep those questions coming in. Now to go straight into the Q&A and not keep Mr. Shetty waiting any longer. Mr. Shetty, what is the total, just to get a big overview of the Middle East steel industry, what is the total installed capacity of Middle East steel mills, especially for flats and related downstream products? And also, what is the flats and longs ratio at present?
Okay, firstly, thank you, Madhumita, for that generous introduction, and thanks to Steel Mint for having me in this session. It's an honor, it's a pleasure. Being an Indian, I always feel proud to be part of any discussion that involves the Indian steel industry, or for that matter, anything to do with India. So, yeah, I'm sure, when you introduced, you said, with the 5 lakh ton, we are the largest galvanized steel producer. So that gives you an idea in terms of what kind of market we are talking about, what is the total size that we have here in the Middle East. So whereas this capacity could be very small compared to any of the Indian steel mills, where each site might be, even having more than this. But that generally gives you an idea in terms of the market here. Now, this region is primarily focused on long products. So if you look at just the GCC countries, we have a total production capacity of almost 26 million tons in long products, whereas in flat, it is hardly about 2 million tons. So that gives you an idea in terms of how skewed it is in terms of the longs versus flat distribution. And if you consider the overall Middle East, which includes the Iran and the other uh, Middle East countries, then we are talking about a total capacity of 65 million tons, of which the flat products is only 11 million tons. So that gives you an idea in terms of how unbalanced the longs versus flat production capacities are in the Middle East. But having said that, that's also primarily to do with the kind of demand that is there in the region. So the region promotes a lot of construction industry, where primarily it is the usage of the long products like wire rods and rebars, which are predominantly required for these purposes. So that sets the tone for the kind of demand that we have in this region.
Right. Sakina, would you like to take the next question?
Yeah. Mr. Shetty, my question is, how much of it is sourced through imports and how much is procured domestically?
Yeah, so as I said, this is the total capacity in terms of what we have here, installed capacities. Okay, now if you look at the demand supply gap, that's primarily on account of flat products. On long products, pretty much the area is sufficient, but on on flat products, we have a deficit of almost about 4 to 5 million tons every year, which is generally being imported. So the domestic production is not able to catch up to that demand as far as flat products are concerned. It's primarily in the form of hot rolled coils and galvanized and painted coils. So whereas on the long product side, we're pretty much self-sufficient. If you compare directly capacity versus the consumption which is happening in the region. But then there is always a certain amount of imports that happens. I mean, there are a lot of restrictions in terms of, let's say, for example, we used to have a lot of rebars getting imported from Turkey and other countries. But now there is sufficient capacities in the region, and we're almost self-sufficient as far as long products are concerned. Yes, on flats, there is a big gap, which currently is being catered to by imports, primarily the imports coming in from India and China. Of course, off late, not much of material is coming in from India, but yes, I mean, China has been able to fill up that gap due to the absence of the Indian mills.
Okay, Mr. Shetty, where domestic production is concerned, what sort of capacity expansion is underway? And going forward, you said that it is very heavily skewed towards longs. So going forward, will the products mix change? Number one, and is there any thought on reducing import dependency?
Yeah, good question, Madhumita. So what's happening is, as I explained, the gap is primarily on account of the flat products. Okay, so there have been some massive projects that have been announced. For example, here in the Emirates, ESA, which is Emirates Steel Arkan, they have announced a fully automated, first of its kind, hot strip mill, which is initially, I mean, the plan was to install about 2 million tons of hot strip mill along with the 2.3 million tons of melt shop and about 2.5 million tons of DRI plant. So this is already announced, and they've already hired Tata Consultancy for the consultancy work. There is a 5 million ton Jindal Shadid plant which has been announced in Oman, which is expected to generate about 5 million tons of green steel investment effective from 2026. In fact, they had originally announced it for 2030, but then it's expected to be preponed. There is another 4 million metric tons of SR steel, which has been announced in Saudi Arabia, in addition to the 1.5 million metric tons of plate plant, which has been announced as a Aramco Bao Steel joint venture, again in Saudi Arabia. So if you notice, a lot of investments that are getting into flat steel production, that is primarily to take care of that gap.
Right.
So my
Tina?
question is, which countries did Middle East source from, and what advantages did it see in importing from other geographies, logistics, prices, whatever?
Oh, yeah, I mean, the natural choice was China. I mean, not that it was something that was the most preferred option, but then, yes, I mean, because of the absence of India and Ukraine, I mean, because a lot of flat products used to come from Ukraine and India, when Indian steel mills, decided not to export so much because there was a healthy domestic demand. So the natural choice was China. In fact, so much so that there are a lot of Chinese mills who have now set up offices in UAE to take care of the local demand that is there. So the earlier perception that, I mean, there is a big difference in terms of the sourcing that was happening in the Middle East. So it used to be the name of the steel mill in India. For example, it used to be JSW, SR, Bhushan. I mean, the names were there and they said this is the brand of hot roll coil that was coming in. Whereas it was always Chinese hot roll. Okay. From there, in the last 1 year, they have specialized into getting brands registered here in the Middle East. So people are aware that there is a quality product that is available from China as well. So a lot of demand that has shifted away to what has been lost from the Indian markets has gone to China. And that has been the single largest supplier of flat steel into this region.
Okay. So
So
under new,
please continue.
under
Second.
new expansion, what sort of products are under consideration, and what is the domestically produced product mix like in flats and longs and in percentage terms at present? Also, what will be the new capacity expansions stress more on?
So, as I said, one definitely is to take care of the existing demand supply gap that is there, which is primarily into construction grade material. Okay, so that is, I mean, as I said, I explained earlier, most of the demand is for construction grade material. But then what is happening now is that there are new plants that have been set up. Let's say, for example, in Saudi Arabia, there are automobile plants. Lucid has announced a facility. Hyundai has announced a facility. So we are expecting that the new capacities would be able to fulfill that demand, which is going to come in from the automobile sector. But otherwise, the existing demand is primarily from the construction sector, where there is a lot of demand because of the infrastructure projects that are going on in this region. So we are expecting that there's going to be a shift in terms of the demand pattern as well, in terms of the end users towards from non-automotive to automotive grade material. So that is going to pick up a lot of, that demand is going to pick up. And therefore, most of these plants which are coming up now are not only geared towards that, and also in terms of looking at how the green steel can be produced, because that's a demand that is there, that's going to increase. So all the new capacities that are coming up are keeping this in mind and making sure that the steel that they produce are more environment friendly and are green. So that is a shift that is happening in terms of how the end users or the end product is being developed.
Right. Mr. Shetty, in 2023, what percentage of the total demand was satisfied by imports? And what percentage of that import quantum was supplied by China in 2023?
So, okay, so most of it, I mean, in terms of volumes, it would be very difficult to make out exactly what volumes had come in. But we were expecting a gap of roughly around 4 million metric tons, which has come in primarily from all the imports put together. But bulk of it, almost about 80% of that, was catered to by China.
How will the ongoing geopolitical tensions and economic sanctions affect global steel trades?
Oh, yeah, I mean, so this, I guess, is not just specific for our region alone, but then I think overall, this is a huge bearing on the steel industry worldwide. It's starting with the Russian conflict, which immediately threw up a huge shortage of steel raw material and steel finished products, to the latest one, which is happening in Israel. So there have been very, very negative impacts, right from the first one when there was a shortage and the US interest rates kept increasing. So that has put pressure on the prices, that has put pressure on the cost of holding and the demand pattern that is there downstream. In fact, we have been dealing with certain countries where there is a huge forex shortage now because of the unfavorable uh, exchange rates that are prevailing. So this has impacted the entire trade flows in the region. I mean, for example, Northern Africa, Northern Egypt used to be a huge market for steel imports. But the moment there was this interest rate hike, some of those large economies had to constrict so much that they were unable to, import any steel because, the forex situation was totally adverse. So it still continues to impact, but then hopefully, if the easing happens now, and with the positive news that we're getting from the US in terms of either holding the interest rates from or maybe possibly decreasing the interest rates in the coming months, that would definitely make a sea change in terms of how the steel demand is going to be playing out in the first quarter at least. Now, that in addition to the general demand and supply which is there, but then if you look at this region, we have got a huge requirement with mega projects that have been announced in the region, which will impact the trade flows. Now, most countries are getting into protectionism, where they're trying to put in safeguards, where they're trying to protect their domestic industry from the inflows from imports from other countries. That again is impacting us in a big time. I mean, a lot of imports used to go from the region to the US. And the moment there was a Section 232, the whole equation has changed. Now, Middle East being a much more open grounds, in fact, we don't have any trade barriers, we don't have any restrictions, has become an easy ground or easy place for all the steel mills to enter, because we have a flat 5% duty on every import that happens. And some end users would also get an exemption if that 5%. So it makes a natural ground for most of the steel producers to enter. So therefore, the trade flows keep changing based on these geopolitical, situations. So yeah, I mean, even for us, it has been the same. The higher interest rate was putting a check in terms of our end users, in terms of their capability to hold onto inventories. So, generally it was subdued for quite some time till real demand came on stream in terms of these larger projects.
Okay. Now, a little shift towards prices. Going forward, what do you feel about export prices? I mean, how do you feel prices would behave in Q1 CY24? And what factors will be influencing this movement?
On a lighter note, Madhumita, if I knew that answer, I wouldn't be sitting here. I would be sitting on a lot of cash around with me. But yeah, I mean, prices, I mean, have just started to improve now with the positive news that's coming out of the US in terms of softer interest rates, that there could be a drop as well. So that would actually boost up the pricing. We see higher cost of raw material. We see higher cost of inputs that are going to drive the steel prices up. We also see that the focus on decarbonization and the green steel is expected to add to the input costs of steel making, which will make steel more expensive in the coming years. So that is our expectation right now. But yes, I mean, all this end of the day would not be possible if there's no underlying demand. So higher prices will also keep a check in terms of the growth of demand. So we're cautiously optimistic in terms of where the prices would be in the first quarter next year.
Okay.
Mr. Shetty, WSA estimates total steel demand in the MENA region to decrease by 3.5% in 2023 and increase by 3.5% in 24. What is the outlook on Middle East steel demand in CY24, and how will this be met? Also, which end user segments will hold promises?
Yes, so Sakina, so if you look at most of the demand for steel in the Gulf region, in the Middle East region, is coming from projects, okay, from construction projects. I'm sure you've seen all the announcements that are happening in Saudi, in the UAE and the region. So we are expected to have growth of about 2% month on month straight for the next 8 months in terms of the project index itself. So currently, the total value of the GCC projects stands at almost $3 trillion. Okay, so that's a huge investment into projects. Some of these projects are long-term infrastructure projects. You've seen the announcement that are coming out of Saudi in terms of their NEOM, which there's an entire city which is being built up. So all the demand that is there is mostly going to come from there. And of late, I'm sure you've heard about how the Expo has been awarded to Saudi, and also the upcoming football FIFA World Cup, which again is going to be hosted by Saudi. So bulk of this demand is going to be driven by these kind of projects which are there. And then, as I explained earlier, there are projects that have been announced for automaking. So there are two major projects that have been announced in Saudi Arabia. Lucid is planning to put up a huge manufacturing facility in which they'll be making. Initially they'll be only assembling about 5,000 vehicles per annum, which is finally going to be ramped up to almost 155,000 electric vehicles per annum. And then Hyundai is also planning to put up another plant there, which will have an annual production capacity of 50,000, both electrical and the IC engines. So that's going to be a massive demand driver as far as the region is concerned in terms of both long products and flat products.
Okay, I come back to China once again, Mr. Shetty. The MENA region has been sourcing steel from China for quite some time. Going forward, what role is China likely to play in the Middle East steel sourcing? If production curbs in China persist, then do you feel the Middle East imports may get impacted?
So as I explained in my earlier answer to my earlier question, to your earlier question, so the region is a net importer of steel. Okay, so as far as the demand is concerned, it will still continue to import a lot of steel, bulk of which is going to be flat steel. On the long products, there's not so much of an impact, but mostly it is hot rolled coils for either re-rolling or for pipe making or for construction sector. Now, if you talk about the demand supply situation, this is likely to continue for some time till all the projects are coming on stream and they are up and running. Till then, it will be a net importer. Now, let's say, for example, if there is a change in terms of Chinese policies towards steel making, or the curb or the restriction on the steel making capacities, again, it will depend on what is the demand that is there, the domestic demand that is there in China. So if the domestic demand continues to shrink or is expected to be slow in the coming years, their export allocation will remain the same, or maybe will not have such a huge impact. Now we saw the same thing with India. So as long as India was exporting steel, so there was import happening here. But the moment the domestic demand grew and there was hardly any allocation available for exports, so it was naturally weaned away and into China and other sources, right? So the situation will be the same. If China drastically reduces, then obviously we'll have to look at other areas from where they can import. But otherwise, the region is set to be a net importer of steel.
Okay, thanks. Taking a look at challenges, what sort of challenges do you foresee in the near future, especially in terms of CBAM implementation? Will there be any implications on the Middle East markets from CBAM?
Yeah, I mean, definitely a burning topic today, but then we need to see how the Middle East markets, Middle East steel producers are geared towards it. If you generally compare the steel making routes, if you look at the Middle East, we are almost 95% of the steel making that's happening in the region is through the EAF route, through the electric arc furnace route. Whereas, it's much lower compared to when you look at the other countries, and the global average is around 28%, and the Middle East is almost at 95%. So, and then there's going to be a general shift towards EAF. That's primarily because of the fact that it's a more greener steel, it's a more environment friendly steel. So a lot of projects are likely to be moving from BOF towards the EAF, which is currently around 28%. It is expected to grow to almost about 43%. So that is the expectation. Now, obviously, that is going to put a lot of pressure on the raw material, especially scrap. So scrap is going to become really short. The supplies are going to be tight because there's going to be demand coming in from most of the steel makers. So currently, because everybody is focusing their expansion on the construction of electric arc furnaces, but what is going to happen is high quality scrap will grow at a much slower rate compared to low quality scrap. So there's going to be a demand shortage. I mean, there's going to be a huge shortage as far as high quality remelting scrap is concerned. Now, the only other factor that's going to be replacing it is DRI. Now, DRI, the total supply today is only about 130 million tons. Okay, now that's the molten steel requirement is almost 1.3 billion tons. So that is going to be a huge shortage as far as DRI is concerned as well. So when you introduce CBAM, that will increase the price of the, let's say, currently what they're using as pig iron, and that will make it very uncompetitive as far as when compared to DRI. So challenges that we face primarily is in terms of steel making and the raw material availability that is going to be there. That from a steel maker's perspective. But look at it from the end user's perspective. Green steel is not going to come any cheaper. Okay, the input costs are going to go up, energy costs are going to go up. Though the effectiveness may be better, but then the costs are going to go up. Whether the end users will be able to absorb these high costs is something that we need to see. Now, CBAM is an effective way of doing it, but whether the end user segment is in a position to take it up in absorb that high cost is something that is a big question mark. So the Middle East is very well geared. I mean, we are pretty much ready as far as complying with the CBAM requirements are concerned. But the fact is whether the end use segment is in a position to take care of it or not.
Okay, thanks a lot. Now, I have two quick questions for the in-house analyst, Sakina. Sakina, number one, can you just walk us through, I mean, since this is a session on exports, we're just moving a little bit away from the Middle East and turning the spotlight on India. Sakina, could you walk us through the current export scenario where Indian mills are concerned, and whether mills are resuming offers, what factors are impelling this, and secondly, what is the outlook for the rest of the financial year, FY24?
Yeah. So after keeping silent for nearly 2 months, Indian mills have resumed its RC-CRC export offers in November. This week, Indian mills have raised its RC export offers to the European Union. It is around by $5 per ton week on week. And current offers are $700 to $705 CFR. So a hike in EU domestic steel prices have supported hike in Indian steel export offers, as EU mill has increased prices by around 30 to 40 euro ex works recently. So, however, Indian HRC export offers for other regions like Southeast Asia and the Middle East continue to remain on hold due to lower export realizations. Talking about the outlook, we expect India's steel exports to drop a sharp 25% in FY24 against 8.75 million tons, which is seen in the last fiscal FY23.
Okay, thanks a lot, Sakina. To come back to Mr. Shetty once again, we know that scrap is becoming, a very scarce commodity going forward, because countries are adopting very, very protectionist measures, keeping the scrap within their own shores. The Middle East has done something similar. So, any comments on that?
Well, I guess, as I said, scrap is going to get scarcer every day. It's going to be a very scarce commodity. So, like all other countries, export of scrap is banned from the region as well, because generation of scrap itself is going to be, very, very less. It's going to decrease as the life of the steel increases. The generation of scrap is going to decrease. So, I guess that's going to be a major factor. And like other countries, even UAE has put restrictions. Saudi, there is a restriction in terms of what scrap can be exported and what cannot be.
So, how do you see this impacting steel prices in the Middle East? Because you already have mentioned that green steel is going to be very expensive, and that is going to have a cascading impact on finished products. And scrap is also another area that needs to be looked into. So, taking a very long-term view.
Yeah, so I guess there's going to be a lot of impetus in terms of newer DRI production capacities that are going to come up. So there is going to be a lot of new facilities that are coming up in the region, especially in Oman and in the UAE, where DRI making is going to be taking up a lot of investments here.
Right. So the Middle East EOE, I would say, is fostering strong partnerships with through trade agreements. So would you like to comment on that
Yeah, so
to facilitate trade and commerce?
yeah, so UAE has signed up, SEPAs with major countries, India being one of them. So in the process, they're trying to increase the bilateral trade that's happening between the two countries, wherein there is a gradual reduction of import duty from both sides. Of course, steel also happens to be part of that agreement. And then there is also a condition of a melt and pour requirement, which means that the steel has to be produced in one of the two countries, either in India or in UAE. From our perspective, it is going to improve a lot of bilateral trade, because then what it means is basically we can import the raw material from India, convert it and send it back under that agreement, and the other way around. So these mutual trade agreements do help boost the steel trade between the two countries, and we are expecting that it should add value to the steel producers in both the places.
So another question: what is the spread? What is the price gap between domestically manufactured steel in the Middle East and imported?
See, Middle East is not a cheap country for making production. Our production costs are pretty high, both in terms of labor, utilities, and availability of raw material. You must understand that all the raw material has to be imported. There is no local production of raw material, unlike in India, where you could go from iron ore to painted coil in one, big facility. But out here, every raw material needs to be imported and then produced and then re-exported. So the cost of manufacture in the domestic for the domestic steel mills is very high. The labor costs are exorbitantly high. General establishment costs are high. It's just that it's got much better value in terms of connectivity, in terms of being located centrally and having access to all the markets. But other than that, purely from a production cost point of view, we do not compete either with India or with China, where the costs are lower or there are government benefits or incentives for exports. So yes, I mean, there is definite advantage in terms of the imported material.
Coming back to the geopolitical issues once again, this Hamas war, is that conflict having any impact on on logistics costs, freight costs, or in any other way? Is it impacting the Middle East in any other way in terms of the steel supply, in terms of any area?
Not really. I mean, there is no direct impact of the conflict as such, because it's happening quite far away, and it's not something which is just start. I mean, of course, it has escalated today to a greater level, but otherwise, it's been simmering for a long time. But since that region does not really cater to any of the steel raw material, it has had so much of an impact. But yes, the sentiments are down. The market sentiments are getting impacted, because it's not something which anybody would like to see. Any kind of violence or conflict, be it in any region, is not welcome, and it's definitely an impediment to the market sentiments. That's one part of it. The second part is there is a lot of influx of refugees and migrants coming into the other regions, the neighboring countries, where there's definitely some amount of pressure in terms of logistics. But again, that has not gone to a level where it is impacting business as such. But as I said, it's more to do with the sentiments than with the actual cost of the war.
Okay, before we close, one last and a very long-term view question. What is your take on steel demand in the Middle East by, say, 2030?
So as I explained, there are a lot of projects which are coming up, okay, and these are all long-term projects. These are not short-term one-year projects. These are things which are likely to be getting commissioned only by 2030. So we see that there is going to be, an escalation of demand for different types of products. To start with, will be the long products which will be required for the construction purposes, and then towards the end of the project, there will be a higher demand for the flat products, the coated products, the galvanized products, and the painted ones, which will get into more towards the finishing of these projects. So we expect a positive demand driver as far as steel is concerned, based on the current ongoing projects and the new projects and the new events that are happening in the region. All the Middle East countries with higher oil prices are, having higher disposable income, which most of it is getting into infrastructure development of rails, development of airports. I mean, there are a lot of projects that are being announced in the region. The GCC country has one of the highest GDP in the world, and they have surplus allocations for this kind of developments. So we see a positive growth. We see that there is going to be demand is going to be good. It's just that there should not be any other cost impediments or issues related to higher interest rates or any kind of logistical disruptions that could impact. But otherwise, overall, we expect the area to be having very good steel demand.
Thanks a lot. We will close this session. Hope the audience found the discussion very informative and useful. We will have another Engage 5.0 session coming up tomorrow at 12:30 p.m. on the topic Navigating India's Ferro-Molybdenum Landscape, Market Trends, Trade Dynamics, and Future Prospects. And we are closing this session, which was on the topic Indian steel exports poised for a rebound. A very warm thank you to our esteemed guest for this afternoon, Mr. B.S. Shetty, General Manager, Commercial, Al Ghurair Iron and Steel, LLC, Abu Dhabi. Thanks to Sakina Rizvi, my colleague at Steel Mint, for co-hosting this webinar with me.
Thank you.
And a big thank you.
Thank you, Sakina. It was a pleasure.
It was a pleasure hosting you also, sir. And big thank you to our esteemed viewers for joining in. I'm Madhumita Mukherjee, Group Editor, Steel Mint, signing out. Bye, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.